5 signs fear is controlling you. Stoicism. You think you're making choices, but you're not. You think you're being careful, strategic, protective, but really, you're just afraid. And fear doesn't announce itself. It doesn't show up wearing a mask saying, "I'm running your life now." It disguises itself as logic, as caution, as being reasonable. It whispers things like, "Maybe later. What if it doesn't work? You're not ready yet." And before you realize it, years have passed, and you're still standing in the same place, convincing yourself you chose to stay there. The Stoics knew something most people never learn. The cage you live in isn't made of circumstances. It's made of the stories you tell yourself to avoid discomfort. And the longer you let fear narrate your life, the smaller that life becomes. Marcus Aurelius said, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." But what happens when the thing controlling your mind isn't an outside event? What happens when the prison guard is your own fear? If you've been feeling stuck, frustrated, like you're capable of more but somehow can't move, stay with this, because we're going to expose the 5 ways fear has been running your decisions without your permission. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people aren't living their lives. They're managing their fears. They don't ask for the promotion because rejection might confirm they're not good enough. They don't start the business because failure would prove they were foolish to try. They don't approach her because hearing no feels like a verdict on their worth. They don't set boundaries because conflict might mean losing someone. So instead of risking discomfort, they choose certainty. They choose the known pain over the unknown possibility. And they call it wisdom. They call it maturity. They call it being realistic. But the Stoics would call it something else: voluntary imprisonment. Seneca wrote, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." Think about that. Most of your suffering isn't happening now. It's happening in the future you're imagining. The rejection you haven't received yet. The failure you haven't experienced yet. The judgment you haven't faced yet. And because you're so busy protecting yourself from imaginary disasters, you're avoiding real opportunities. You're sacrificing actual growth to prevent hypothetical pain. That's what fear does. It doesn't just stop you from doing dangerous things. It stops you from doing anything that might challenge the fragile comfort you've built. And over time, that comfort becomes a coffin. You might think you're safe, but you're just stuck. You might think you're being smart, but you're just being scared. And the worst part? You've gotten so good at rationalizing it that you don't even notice anymore. But your body knows. Your gut knows. That restlessness you feel, that quiet voice saying, "There has to be more than this." That's not dissatisfaction. That's your soul recognizing the gap between who you are and who you could be. And the only thing standing in that gap is fear. So let's look at the 5 signs that fear has been making your decisions. And let's decide whether you're going to keep letting it. Sign 1. You've perfected the art of someday. I'll start when I'm ready. I'll do it when the timing's better. I'll make the move when I'm more prepared. Someday. Later. Soon. Eventually. These aren't plans. They're escape hatches. They're the words you use when you're too afraid to admit you're too afraid. Because here's the truth. You're never going to feel ready. The conditions are never going to be perfect. The fear is never going to disappear before you act. That's not how courage works. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to move despite it. And every time you postpone action, waiting for fear to subside, you're training yourself to obey it. You're teaching your nervous system that discomfort is a stop sign instead of a starting line. The Stoics called this premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. But they didn't use it to avoid action. They used it to prepare for it. They imagined the worst outcomes, not to scare themselves into paralysis, but to realize that even the worst-case scenario was survivable. So what happens if you start the business and it fails? You learn, you adapt, you try again, you don't die. What happens if you ask her out and she says no? You feel uncomfortable for a few days, then you move on. Your worth doesn't evaporate. What happens if you speak your truth and people judge you? Some will. And you'll discover that their opinions don't actually control your reality. But when you live in someday, none of that gets tested. You just stay suspended in the fantasy that one day, magically, you'll be brave enough. One day, you'll wake up confident. One day, the circumstances will align perfectly. They won't. And every day you wait, you're not preserving your potential. You're letting it atrophy. Because potential unexpressed isn't noble. It's just wasted. Epictetus said, "How long are you going to wait before you demand the best for yourself?" That question should sting. Because the answer, if you're honest, is, as long as I can get away with it. As long as I can convince myself that waiting is the same as preparing. But it's not. Preparation moves you forward. Waiting keeps you safe. And safety, when chosen repeatedly over growth, becomes stagnation. So ask yourself, what have you been What's the thing you keep saying you'll do when the time is right? Now ask the harder question. What if the time is never going to feel right, and you've been using that as permission to never try? That's fear, and it's been winning. Sign 2. You obsess over outcomes you can't control. You play out conversations before they happen. You rehearse arguments in the shower. You imagine every way things could go wrong, and then treat those imagined disasters like confirmed prophecies. And because you can't control the outcome, you either overplan to the point of paralysis or avoid the situation entirely. This is fear wearing the mask of being prepared. The Stoics understood something crucial. There's a difference between preparation and obsession. Preparation accepts uncertainty and focuses on what you can control, your effort, your attitude, your response. Obsession tries to control uncertainty itself, which is impossible, so it just creates anxiety. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Confine yourself to the present, not because the future doesn't matter, but because worrying about it accomplishes nothing. You can't control whether she says yes. You can control whether you ask. You can't control whether the business succeeds. You can control whether you build it with integrity." But when fear is in charge, it convinces you that if you just think hard enough, plan long enough, anticipate every variable, you can guarantee success. So you get trapped in analysis. You research endlessly. You make pro/con lists for the same decision 17 times. You seek advice from people who don't have the answers either. All of it is just fear dressed up as diligence. Because the truth is, most decisions don't require more information. They require more courage. You already know what you need to do. You're just hoping that if you delay long enough, the fear will go away, or the universe will decide for you. It won't. And while you're waiting for certainty, life is passing. Opportunities are expiring. Other people, less qualified, less prepared, but more willing to act, are taking the chances you're still thinking about. Carl Jung said, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." But you can't become anything if you're paralyzed by what might happen. You have to accept that you don't get to know the ending before you start. You have to make peace with the fact that failure is possible, rejection is possible, and you're going to do it anyway. Because the alternative, spending your life on the sidelines, safe but small, that's not wisdom. That's just slow death. So what are you obsessing over right now? What outcome are you trying to predict, control, guarantee before you make a move? Let it go. Not recklessly, but consciously. Focus on what you can actually influence. Your preparation, your character, your actions. The rest, let it unfold. That's not giving up control. That's reclaiming it from fear. Sign 3. You need permission to want what you want. You don't just pursue your goals. You explain them, justify them, defend them to people who didn't even ask. You need other people to validate your desires before you'll allow yourself to chase them. You need someone to tell you it's okay to want more, to try harder, to take up space. And if they don't give you that permission, you shrink, you downplay. You say things like, it's not a big deal, or, I don't know, maybe it's stupid. This is fear of judgment, and it's killing your ambition, quietly, one self-dismissal at a time. The Stoics believed in living according to nature, meaning living in alignment with your true self, not the version other people are comfortable with. But when you need external permission to want what you want, you're not living according to your nature. You're living according to their expectations. And here's the brutal part. Most people will never give you that permission, not because they're cruel, but because your ambition makes them uncomfortable. It reminds them of their own unrealized potential. It challenges the comfort they've settled for. So they'll disguise their discomfort as concern. They'll say things like, "Are you sure that's realistic? What if it doesn't work out? Don't you think you should be more practical?" And because you're already afraid, their doubt becomes confirmation. You hear their hesitation and think, "See, even they think it's a bad idea. I should just stay where I am." But Seneca warned, associate with people who are likely to improve you. And people who need you to stay small so they can feel comfortable, they're not improving you. They're anchoring you. You don't owe anyone an explanation for your dreams. You don't need a committee to approve your goals. You don't need consensus to validate what burns inside you. If you want to build something, build it. If you want to change careers, change them. If you want to walk away from what's not serving you, walk away. Not recklessly, not without thought, but without needing applause or permission from people who aren't living your life. Because here's what happens when you keep seeking approval. You never move. Or worse, you move toward goals that aren't even yours. You chase the life other people think you should want, because you're too afraid to claim the one you actually do. And years from now, you'll look back and realize you built someone else's dream, while yours died waiting for permission that was never going to come. So ask yourself, what do you want that you've been too afraid to claim? What ambition have you been downplaying because you're worried about what people will think? Say it out loud, write it down, own it. Not for them, for you. That's not arrogance. That's self-respect. And it's the first step toward breaking fear's grip. Sign 4. You avoid conflict at the cost of your integrity. You don't say what you really think. You don't set boundaries. You don't push back when someone crosses a line. Why? Because confrontation feels dangerous. Disagreement feels like loss. So you smile, nod, and swallow what you really want to say, because keeping the peace feels safer than risking the relationship. But here's what you're actually doing. You're choosing comfort over character. The Stoics believed that virtue, living according to your principles, was the highest good. Not comfort, not approval, not harmony at all costs. Marcus Aurelius wrote, If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it. But when fear controls you, you reverse that. You do what's not right because it's easier. You say what's not true because it's safer. You betray yourself quietly, repeatedly, in small moments that add up to a life you don't recognize. And every time you avoid conflict to preserve a relationship, you're not protecting the relationship, you're eroding it. Because relationships built on pretense don't last, they corrode. And eventually, you wake up surrounded by people who don't actually know you because you've been too afraid to show them. Here's the truth. Conflict isn't the enemy. Dishonesty is. When you speak your truth with respect, you give the other person a chance to meet you there. Some will, some won't. And the ones who can't handle your honesty, they were never going to handle the real you anyway. You were just postponing the inevitable by pretending to be smaller, quieter, more agreeable than you are. Epictetus said, "First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do." So who would you be if you weren't afraid of conflict? What would you say if you knew it wouldn't cost you love? What boundary would you set if you trusted that the right people would respect it? That version of you already exists. You're just keeping them locked away to protect people who might not even want the fake version you're offering. And the cost? Your integrity, your self-respect, your ability to look in the mirror and recognize the person staring back. So start small. Say the thing you've been holding back. Set the boundary you've been avoiding. Disagree when you actually disagree. Not to be difficult, not to cause drama, but to stop betraying yourself for the illusion of harmony. Because a life without conflict isn't peaceful. It's just quiet. And there's a difference. Sign 5. You celebrate not losing more than you celebrate winning. You don't take risks because you've redefined success as avoiding failure. You're proud that you didn't embarrass yourself, didn't get rejected, didn't lose money, didn't look foolish. You measure your life by what didn't go wrong instead of what you actually built. And on the surface, that sounds smart, conservative, realistic. But it's not. It's just fear convincing you that survival is the same as living. The Stoics didn't celebrate mediocrity. They celebrated virtue in action, courage, discipline, wisdom, justice. And none of those virtues are demonstrated by playing it safe. Seneca wrote, "It is not because things are difficult that we do not dare. It is because we do not dare that they are difficult." Read that again. The difficulty you're so afraid of, most of it exists because you haven't tried yet. Because you've let the fear grow bigger than the actual obstacle. Because you've spent so much time imagining failure that you've convinced yourself it's inevitable. But when you finally move, when you take the risk, start the thing, say the truth, you often find it wasn't as hard as you thought. And even when it is hard, even when it doesn't work out perfectly, you discover something crucial. You survive, and you grow. But you'll never know that if your highest goal is to avoid losing. Because avoiding loss means avoiding growth. It means staying in the shallow end forever, congratulating yourself for not drowning while never learning to swim. And over time, that becomes your identity. You become the person who doesn't do that kind of thing, who isn't built for risk, who prefers stability. But that's not who you are. That's just who fear has shaped you into. So what would winning actually look like for you? Not just not failing, but actually succeeding. What would you build if the goal was to create something meaningful instead of just protecting what you have? What would you attempt if you measured success by effort and courage instead of guaranteed outcomes? Those questions are uncomfortable because they expose how much you've been settling, how much you've been calling caution what's really just cowardice. But they're also liberating, because they remind you that you're allowed to want more. You're allowed to try. You're allowed to fail and try again. You're allowed to live like someone who's here to build, not just to survive. And when you make that shift, when you start celebrating the attempt instead of just the absence of disaster, everything changes. Because suddenly, failure isn't the enemy, inaction is. And fear? Fear loses its grip the moment you decide that living fully is worth more than staying safe. So let's be honest. If you recognized yourself in even one of these signs, fear has been running more of your life than you want to admit. And that's not a judgment. It's just the truth. Fear is smart. It doesn't show up like a villain. It shows up like a friend. It says it's protecting you, keeping you grounded, helping you be realistic. But protection becomes a prison when it stops you from growing. And realism becomes resignation when it keeps you from trying. The Stoics understood that fear isn't the problem. Obedience to fear is. You're going to feel afraid. That's human. But you don't have to let that fear make your decisions. You don't have to let it choose your career, your relationships, your goals, your words. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." Your fear isn't blocking your path. It is the path. It's showing you exactly where you need to grow, exactly what you need to face, exactly who you need to become. And you don't become that person by avoiding discomfort. You become that person by walking straight into it, not recklessly, but deliberately, with your eyes open, with your principles intact. So here's what changes starting now. You stop waiting for someday. You start today, imperfectly, incompletely, but actually. You stop obsessing over outcomes. You focus on what you can control, your effort, your integrity, your response. You stop seeking permission. You claim what you want without apology or explanation. You stop avoiding conflict. You speak your truth and let the wrong people leave. You stop celebrating survival. You start celebrating courage, even when it doesn't lead to victory. And slowly, brick by brick, you build a life that's yours. Not the safe version, not the one fear approved, but the real one. The one that requires you to be brave. Because that's what freedom actually is. Not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let it lead. So here's your challenge. Pick one area where fear has been making your decisions. Just one. Maybe it's the conversation you've been avoiding, the project you've been postponing, the boundary you've been too afraid to set, the risk you've been calling irresponsible. And this week, not someday, this week, do the thing that scares you. Not perfectly, not with all the answers, just do it. Because every time you act despite the fear, you break its power a little. You prove to yourself that you're not as fragile as fear convinced you were. You reclaim a piece of your life. And over time, those pieces add up. They become momentum. They become identity. You stop being the person who lets fear decide. You become the person who feels the fear and moves anyway. And that person? That's who you were always meant to be. Stay focused, stay grounded, and remember, the quiet work you do when no one's watching is what builds the strength they'll never see coming.